Darth Nihilus is one of the most mysterious and terrifying figures in the Star Wars universe. A Sith Lord of unimaginable power, he became an almost mythical figure of fear and destruction, his name whispered in dread by those who witnessed his rampages. Nihilus' true identity, motivations, and backstory are shrouded in mystery, making him a unique and intriguing character within the lore of the Sith and the dark side. Unlike many other Sith Lords who sought power for personal gain or dominion over the galaxy, Darth Nihilus became something altogether different. A being whose hunger for destruction was driven by a far more insidious force, an insatiable need to consume life itself. His journey from a simple Jedi to the Sith Lord known as Darth Nihilus is one of corruption, loss, and the ultimate transformation into an entity that could only be described as a walking, breathing void. Before he became Darth Nihilus, he was once a Jedi Knight. His name before his fall to the dark side remains unknown, as the man who would become Nihilus lost all identity when he was consumed by the Force that would eventually turn him into a Sith. His early life was similar to many other Jedi of his time. He was dedicated to the Order, trained in the ways of the Force, and upheld the ideals of peace and harmony. However, his life took a dark and tragic turn during the events surrounding the Mandalorian Wars, a conflict that saw many Jedi splinter from the Order due to the Council's refusal to intervene. Nihilus was one of those Jedi who defied the Council, choosing to join the war effort in opposition to the Council's strictures. The Mandalorian Wars were a defining moment for many Jedi, and for Nihilus, it would be the beginning of his descent into darkness. The war, with its brutality and destruction, had a profound effect on those involved. As the Jedi fought in the war, many began to question the Order's adherence to pacifism, and Nihilus was no exception. The toll the war took on him was immense, and as his own power grew, so did his feelings of resentment toward the Jedi Council. Like many others, he believed that the Jedi Order's neutrality in the face of such an existential threat was an act of cowardice, and it was this belief that ultimately separated him from the rest of the Order. However, the true turning point for Darth Nihilus came with the events surrounding the death of the Jedi Exile. Following the war, the Jedi Exile's actions would lead to a cataclysmic event that altered Nihilus' path forever. After the Exile's departure, the galaxy was left in turmoil, and Nihilus, along with his eventual ally Darth Shaun, was left in the aftermath of a shattered galaxy. It was during this time of chaos that Nihilus would encounter the Sith teachings and begin to form his own ideology. In his search for power, Nihilus stumbled upon the ruins of the Sith Empire, and in doing so, he discovered a power unlike any other. It was on the planet of Malachor V, where he would experience the first catalyst of his transformation. Nihilus was caught in a deadly ritual, and in his desperation to survive and harness greater power, he succumbed to the dark side in a way few ever had. His body was destroyed in the process, but his spirit and soul were twisted and warped by the immense power of the dark side. The ritual imbued him with an insatiable hunger, a hunger that would forever define his existence. His body, now little more than a hollowed-out shell, became a vessel for the dark side, and he became a creature that needed to consume life force to sustain himself. Nihilus was no longer a man. He was something else entirely, an entity of pure darkness, driven by an overwhelming and unquenchable hunger. His physical form was little more than a mask to hide the decaying, empty vessel that he had become. His presence was a void, a black hole that devoured the life force of everything it touched. This hunger became his defining characteristic, the driving force behind his every action. It consumed him completely, until there was nothing left of the man he had once been. The once proud Jedi had become Darth Nihilus, a Sith Lord whose very existence was a contradiction. He was neither fully alive nor fully dead, his hunger for life force becoming the only thing that defined him. Nihilus' very presence was enough to drain the life from entire worlds. On worlds he visited, entire populations would fall silent, their life forces slowly being consumed until nothing was left but empty husks. Nihilus did not need to physically engage in battle. His power was so great that it could kill entire armies with a mere thought. He became a symbol of death and destruction, a harbinger of doom who left nothing in his wake but emptiness. Nihilus' role in the galaxy's unfolding events is deeply tied to the fractured state of the Sith at the time. He did not have the same kind of grand ambition as other Sith Lords, such as Darth Sidious or Darth Vader. His goals were simpler: consume and survive. He found strength in his endless hunger, and his desire for power was focused entirely on sustaining his existence. However, his hunger also made him dangerous in ways that others could not understand. Nihilus was driven by an insatiable void inside of him, and he believed that in consuming others, he could fill this emptiness. But no matter how much he consumed, the hunger always returned, unyielding and eternal. Over time, Nihilus would become part of the Sith Triumvirate alongside Darth Shaun and Darth Traya. Each member of the Triumvirate had their own twisted philosophy of the Sith, but Nihilus was singular in its obsession with destruction. His role within the Triumvirate was unique in that he had little interest in politics, power struggles, or conquest. His only focus was consuming life and feeding the hunger that ruled his existence. In contrast to his Sith counterparts, who sought to manipulate and control others, Nihilus was a force of pure annihilation, a being who wanted only to consume. Nihilus' actions were not just destructive but were also symbolic of the ultimate fate of those who fall too deeply into the dark side. He was a Sith Lord, but he had become a monster, a force of nature who could no longer think beyond his own insatiable need to feed. He lacked the complex motivations of other Sith Lords, driven more by instinct and need than by ambition or power. His lack of true individuality is what made him such a terrifying presence. He was no longer a man, but an embodiment of destruction, his entire existence built around consuming and devouring life. He was both the predator and the prey, trapped in an endless cycle of hunger that he could never satisfy. Nihilus' eventual downfall came at the hands of the Jedi exile, who, unlike others before them, was able to resist Nihilus' attempts to consume their life force. The exile's ability to block the Sith Lord's drain on their own energy allowed them to strike back, ending Nihilus' reign of terror. It was a fitting end for a character who had long since ceased to be human, a creature whose identity had been consumed by the very darkness that had once empowered him. Darth Nihilus' fall was not the end of his hunger, but it marked the end of his terrifying reign over the galaxy. The entity that was once a man was finally destroyed, and the galaxy breathed a collective sigh of relief. Darth Nihilus is a tragic figure in the Star Wars mythos, one who represents the ultimate consequence of embracing the dark side. He was a Jedi who sought to do good but was ultimately consumed by the very darkness he once fought against. His hunger, both literal and metaphorical, defined his life and his fall. Nihilus became a being of pure destruction, incapable of experiencing redemption, and his story serves as a reminder of the danger of losing oneself in the pursuit of power. The man who became Darth Nihilus is a cautionary tale, one of a person who lost everything in the endless pursuit of more and more, until all that remained was an empty shell, forever driven by an insatiable hunger that could never be filled. Darth Nihilus' story stands as one of the most haunting and tragic in the Star Wars universe. He began as a Jedi who, like so many before him, sought to protect the galaxy, but he fell into the depths of the dark side through a combination of personal failure, the chaos of war, and a unique and catastrophic encounter that forever altered his nature. His journey from a man to a hollow shell of destruction was not a simple one, nor was it born from an innate thirst for power in the traditional sense seen in Sith Lords like Darth Sidious or Darth Vader. Instead, Nihilus was consumed by a literal hunger for life itself, turning him into something far more monstrous than a mere Sith Lord. His very existence became a paradox, as he was simultaneously alive and dead, an entity both of the Force and beyond it. After his transformation on Malachor V, where he became the monstrous Sith Lord Darth Nihilus, he was no longer bound by the same needs that drove most beings in the galaxy. He no longer cared about personal ambition or ruling the galaxy. His sole purpose was to feed. Malachor V, the site of the Jedi exile's final battle against the Sith Lords and a key turning point in the Star Wars timeline, became the breeding ground for Nihilus power. Here, the consequences of the exile's actions during the Mandalorian Wars and the subsequent events that led to the Jedi's near extinction created the perfect storm for Nihilus' rebirth as an entity of endless hunger. The tragedy of Nihilus lies in the fact that, unlike the Sith who take power to build or control, he was not interested in ruling or subjugating others. Instead, he became a force of pure destruction, driven by an insatiable need to consume the life force of every living being in his vicinity. His hunger knew no bounds, and it shaped his very essence. To his followers, his powers were awe-inspiring. He could drain entire planets of their life force, reducing once thriving civilizations to empty, lifeless husks, with only a faint memory of existence lingering in the wake of his passage. His sheer destructive power created fear and reverence in equal measure. But this same power, which made him a near-unstoppable force in the galaxy, was also the source of his undoing. Unlike other Sith Lords, whose ambitions and desires for control allowed them to plot and scheme, Darth Nihilus lacked any coherent vision for the future. His consuming hunger was all that drove him. He was a walking contradiction, a being who existed solely to devour others, yet who was not truly alive himself. His transformation on Malachor V had stripped away all aspects of humanity, leaving behind only a ravenous creature driven by an insatiable thirst. The paradox of his existence was that Nihilus was more powerful than most Sith Lords, but it was that same power that prevented him from ever truly finding peace or closure. He was trapped in an endless cycle of consumption and destruction, never able to truly satisfy the emptiness that had consumed his soul. This lack of direction or purpose was one of the reasons why Darth Nihilus proved to be such a dangerous and unstable figure. He had no long-term goals, no personal motivations other than feeding on the life force of others. In contrast to more calculating Sith Lords like Darth Sidious, who sought power for power's sake and had a clear vision for the galaxy, Nihilus was an anomaly. His hunger made him a force of nature, one that could not be easily controlled or predicted. Unlike other Sith, who may have sought to manipulate or control their followers, Nihilus was a master of destruction. His presence was a death sentence to entire populations, a silent killer whose very existence threatened the very fabric of life. As his power grew, so did the isolation that came with it. Nihilus was no longer truly a being capable of forming personal connections. His obsession with consuming the life force of others meant that he was forever disconnected from the living galaxy. His relationship with his allies, Sith Lords like Darth Shaun and Darth Traya, was ultimately a relationship built on fear and utility, not camaraderie or mutual respect. He was not someone who formed lasting bonds, and his hunger for life force meant that he treated even his allies with indifference, as little more than sources of sustenance. His only real goal was to feed and maintain his existence, and that meant he could never afford to be weak or allow any emotional ties to distract him from his one purpose. In his role within the Sith Triumvirate, alongside Shaun and Traya, Nihilus' power made him a terrifying figure. While Traya sought to manipulate and control the Sith, and Shaun sought to use their combined might to further his own personal goals, Nihilus operated on a level apart from both of them. His power came not from political maneuvering or military strategy, but from his overwhelming, almost godlike ability to drain the life from entire populations. His influence was felt across the galaxy, but it was also the very thing that made him such a dangerous, unpredictable force. While Traya and Shaun could be reasoned with, or at least manipulated, Nihilus had no such inclinations. He was a being of pure destruction, making him the most uncontrollable of the Sith Triumvirate. Despite his power, however, Nihilus was not invincible. The fact that he was driven by a hunger that could never be satisfied made him vulnerable in a way that other Sith Lords were not. While his ability to drain the life force of others was terrifying, it also made him dependent on that very energy to sustain his existence. His insatiable thirst was a weakness in itself, one that ultimately contributed to his downfall. It was his inability to truly live, to form connections, to experience anything beyond the endless consumption, that rendered him incomplete and ultimately led to his defeat. Nihilus' story is one of tragic irony. The more he consumed, the more he became empty, a hollow shell that could never find peace. In the end, it was the Jedi exile, a former Jedi who had been exiled by the Council after the Mandalorian Wars, who was able to defeat Nihilus. The exile, who had previously been cast out by the Jedi for their refusal to embrace the Force fully, became the key to Nihilus' defeat. Unlike others, the exile was able to resist Nihilus' attempts to drain their life force, and this resistance allowed them to strike back against him. The exile, using both their connection to the Force and their ability to manipulate the energies around them, was able to weaken Nihilus enough to deliver the final blow. The very thing that Nihilus had relied on to sustain himself, his ability to feed on the life force of others, was turned against him by the exile, leading to his destruction. Darth Nihilus, a being who had once been a Jedi and who had been transformed into a force of pure destruction, met his end because he had become a slave to his own hunger. His insatiable need for power, for life force, ultimately led to his downfall. Nihilus' story is a reflection of the dangers of the dark side, of the consequences of surrendering to a power so great that it consumes the very essence of what makes a person human. He was a cautionary tale of how ambition, unchecked and allowed to run wild, can twist and destroy even the most promising of individuals. In his final moments, Nihilus was more than just a Sith Lord. He was a tragic figure who had lost everything. His quest for power had not given him what he sought, and his insatiable hunger had only led him to become an empty vessel, incapable of ever finding peace or satisfaction. In the end, Darth Nihilus was not a symbol of Sith power but a symbol of the dangers of losing oneself in the pursuit of destruction. His story is a powerful reminder that power, when sought for the wrong reasons, can turn even the mightiest into nothing more than a hollow shell.